The sun shone brightly over the chaotic marketplace, its warm rays bouncing off piles of golden trinkets and the shimmering skins of exotic fruits. The air was thick with the clamor of vendors shouting their prices, the intoxicating smells of street food frying, and the flutter of colorful banners hanging from every corner. There was a certain wild energy here, a sense of frenetic life that buzzed through the crowds, pulling in anyone who was looking for something, anything, to make their life better. In the midst of all this, a small, nearly invisible booth sat quietly in the corner. The black cloth draped over its frame absorbed the sunlight, casting everything around it in shadow. At first glance, the booth looked empty, uninviting even, but the keen-eyed noticed the gleam of something nestled under the folds of the cloth. A bottle. Glass. Shimmering. Almost alive. And that's all it took for the curious to draw near. "Elixir of Life," read the small, worn sign hung above the booth, written in elegant script. It looked so promising, too promising. The air around it seemed to vibrate with a subtle hum, a faint promise of something greater, something beyond what anyone could even comprehend. And so, people came, some arrived desperate, clinging to the hope that this was the answer to their fears of death. Some came out of pure curiosity, laughing at the idea of immortality but unable to resist the pull of a mystery so grand. And some, those who could afford it, arrived with an arrogant confidence, assuming this would be just another thing to add to their collection of luxuries. No one was prepared for what the elixir really was, or, rather, what it cost. At the center of the booth stood the time merchant. His face was a blur, hidden in the shadow of his hood. His robes were deep black, almost blending with the backdrop, and his voice, when he spoke, was smooth, like it was crafted to put your mind at ease. He looked ageless. He could have been 12 or 1200. It didn't matter. His job was the same, to sell time. A line had already formed before the booth when a figure, cloaked in the deep colors of age, made his way toward it. He was no ordinary customer. His name was Zev, the 1,000-year-old man, though he looked as though he were little more than a broken man with no more time to waste. His eyes, tired but sharp, scanned the booth, narrowing as they landed on the time merchant. Zev had heard the rumors. The whispers about a cure for time itself. The stories from desperate people who had taken the elixir, only to end up hollowed out and lost in their own skin. Immortality, it seemed, came at a cost. But what exactly was the cost? The rumors were vague, and Zev had no patience for vague. He had already seen the price of time, he had seen it too many times in his long existence. What is this nonsense? Zev demanded, his voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd fell silent as he stepped closer to the booth. "You call it the elixir of life? What does it really do?" The time merchant looked up, a glimmer of amusement in the depths of his hidden eyes. "Ah, an astute one," he said, his voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. "You've heard of it, then?" "More than I care to," Zev muttered, his tone sharp. "But I know a scam when I see one." The time merchant's smile widened, though the expression remained hidden in the shadows. "You misunderstand, old man. The elixir is not a scam. It is a gift, an offering, if you will. For those who seek the one thing they cannot have, more time." Zev raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "And what does it cost?" The time merchant's smile faltered just for a moment. "It costs what it always costs. A piece of you. A piece of your life." Zev scoffed. "A piece of my life? You expect people to trade their soul for this nonsense?" The time merchant shrugged slightly. "A soul, perhaps, but not in the way you think. You see, for every day that the elixir adds to your life, a part of your essence is given in return. It's an exchange, simple as that." Zev's eyes narrowed. "So, what? I take the elixir, and suddenly I'm alive forever?" "Not forever," the time merchant replied, his tone still calm, almost comforting. "Just as long as you desire it. Every day, Every drop you take, you gain another day, another chance to live. But it's not without consequence. You must understand that. Time is not something that can be gained without losing something of equal value. Zev studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. How many people have you tricked into this? The time merchant didn't flinch. Tricked? No. They come to me willingly. You must understand, Zev, it's not a matter of trickery. It's a matter of desire. You are not the first to seek out more time. And you will not be the last. Zev's lips curled in disgust. I've lived 1,000 years. Seen kings rise and fall. I know a lie when I hear one. And I see it in your eyes. You are no savior. You are nothing but a thief. The time merchant's expression didn't change. I am no thief. I am simply the mirror of human desire. What people want, I give. But in the end, it is they who pay the price. Time, after all, is a currency like any other. Zev's fury boiled over. You take from them without them even knowing. You feed on their desperation and turn their hopes into chains. The time merchant tilted his head, the faintest hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. And what is life, Zev, but a series of desires? You've lived 1,000 years. Tell me, do you not still yearn for something more? Zev stiffened. That's not the point. No, the time merchant agreed softly, it's not the point. But it is the reality. And it's a reality that you, like everyone else, must face. Zev clenched his fists. What are you offering, then? To make me like you? To live forever, to feed on the lives of others? The time merchant's voice softened. I offer no such thing. I simply offer what they ask for, more time. And you, Zev, like everyone else, have your own desires. A thirst that cannot be quenched by mere mortal time. Zev felt a chill run through him. He had lived so long, seen so much. He had known men who begged for immortality, only to curse their existence after they received it. He had watched civilizations rise and fall in the blink of an eye. But what the time merchant said had a sting to it. Was it true? Did his own hunger for time, his own endless pursuit of answers, blind him to the reality of his existence? What are you really after? Zev asked, his voice sharp. What's your endgame? What do you gain from this? The time merchant's smile finally faded, replaced by something deeper, something almost sad. I gain nothing, Zev. I simply exist in the space between time. I offer what people want, and I watch them take it. But the price they pay is always more than they expect. Zev stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. You mean, they lose their essence? Their very life force? The time merchant nodded. Yes. Time is not free, and immortality is not without cost. The elixir is a way for them to feed their hunger for more time, but it only deepens the void inside them. They become less and less of themselves until all that remains is the hunger for more. And then, when they have nothing left to give, they simply fade. Zev's stomach churned. And you, watch them fade? The time merchant didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on Zev for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and quiet. I am not the one who takes their time, Zev. They do that themselves. Zev's heart sank. He had thought he was here to confront a villain, to unmask a fraud. But in that moment, he realized that the true villain wasn't the time merchant, it was humanity itself. It was the endless desire for more time, for more life, that drove people to make these deals. It was a hunger that couldn't be satisfied, no matter how much they gave. The 1,000-year-old man stood there, his mind spinning. This wasn't the simple scam he had thought it was. It was something deeper, something more insidious, and in that moment, he understood. The weight of the time merchant's words hung in the air, suffocating Zev. The marketplace buzzed around him, people laughing, shouting, buying and selling, but all that noise seemed distant now, as if the world had slowed down. The time merchant had said more than Zev could fully understand. His anger, once fiery and all-consuming, had now shifted into something darker. A cold realization gnawed at him, something that made his stomach churn, something he wasn't quite ready to confront. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to say next. His entire life, no, his entire existence, had been spent searching for something, for answers, for a way to undo the deep regret that haunted him. He had thought immortality was the answer, the key to escaping the void of loss. But now, staring into the shadowed face of the time merchant, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. "You're saying this isn't a scam," Zev finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying people willingly choose this? They pay for this?" The time merchant's form seemed to shift, a subtle movement, almost as if time itself bent around him. "Yes. They pay for what they desire. What they crave. What they cannot face. But in the end, they do not realize that the price they pay is not simply time. It's themselves." Zev clenched his fists. "And what do you gain from this, huh? You profit from their desperation? You feed on their ignorance?" The time merchant gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I do not profit, Zev. Not in the way you think. I am a reflection of what they want, nothing more. I offer them time, yes, but it is always a trade. They give, and they gain, but they never understand that they're giving away the very thing that makes them who they are, their essence, their vitality. I am not the thief, Zev. I am merely the messenger. I only show them what they're willing to trade." Zev's mind reeled. He had lived for 1,000 years, had seen empires rise, seen kings and queens, soldiers and beggars, all fight for the same thing, time. But he had never considered that it was not the passing of years that was the true gift, it was how one lived those years. The merchant didn't take their time. He gave them what they wanted, and in doing so, stripped them of everything that truly made them human. "People are fools," Zev muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. "I've watched them for centuries, watched them fight for immortality, for more years, more chances. But they never stop to ask themselves why. They never realize that time isn't something that can be owned." The time merchant's eyes glittered, his voice soft but steady. "And yet, that is exactly what makes them human. They want what they cannot have. They want time, not because they understand its value, but because they fear its end. They fear what they do not control." Zev's hands were shaking, his fury boiling beneath the surface, but beneath it, something else was rising, a terrible, bitter understanding. He had spent so many years chasing an answer. A way to turn back the clock. To undo the pain of his past. But what had he really wanted? Immortality? A life without end? Or simply a way to escape the grief that had held him captive for centuries? "You think I don't understand what they're after?" Zev spat. "I know exactly what they're after. I was them. I used to crave it too, the promise of endless time. But you're wrong about one thing, time merchant. Time is not something to be given away. It's not a gift, it's a curse. A test. And yet," the time merchant said, his voice growing quiet, "they will keep coming. You may know this better than anyone. You, who have lived longer than most, and still, you long for something more. More time. More understanding. More life." Zev took a step forward, his voice sharp, but with a trace of sadness. "I'm not like them. I don't want to live forever. I've seen what immortality does to people. It warps them. Makes them hollow. It destroys everything that makes life worth living." The time merchant regarded him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Then why are you here, Zev?" Why did you come seeking me? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, Zev was silent, the answer slipping away before he could grasp it. What had he been looking for? What had driven him here, to this strange marketplace, to this stall, to this moment? The truth was, he had been chasing a shadow. A hope. A desire that could never be fulfilled. I came because I thought you could fix it, Zev said, his voice cracking. I thought you could make it all go away. I thought if I found you, if I confronted you, I could finally find peace. I could undo everything I've lost. The time merchant's expression softened, but just barely. You cannot undo what is lost, Zev. You cannot unmake what is done. Time is not a thing to be controlled. It is to be lived. Zev's mind flashed back to the countless moments of his life. The faces of those he had loved, the people he had lost. The fleeting moments of joy, of triumph, of heartbreak. His heart ached with the weight of it. Time had never been the problem. It was his own refusal to face the truth of it. What do you mean, to be lived? Zev asked, his voice small now, almost lost in the sea of voices around them. The time merchant stepped forward, his figure seemingly growing taller, as if made of the very fabric of time itself. It means that time is not the enemy, Zev. Your quest for eternity, it's born of a desire to escape death, to outrun the inevitable. But that fear, that is what makes you forget how precious each moment is. It's not immortality you seek, but understanding. Zev shook his head, his heart heavy with the burden of the words. So, I'm supposed to accept it all? The loss? The grief? You want me to just live with it? I'm not telling you to do anything, Zev. I'm simply showing you what your quest has cost you. And what it might still cost you. Zev's chest tightened. The time merchant had said it before, and now it was clearer than ever. Time wasn't something to be cheated, to be manipulated. It was something to be experienced. The past was gone, and the future was always just out of reach. All that was left was the present, the moments that slipped by unnoticed, until they were gone. The realization hit Zev with the force of a tidal wave. He had been so consumed by his desire to change what had already happened that he had neglected the gift of living in the now. The pain, the regret, the longing, it all faded into the background as the truth settled in his heart. I've wasted so much time, Zev whispered, more to himself than to the time merchant. The time merchant nodded, his voice low and steady. Yes. But there is still time left. You cannot undo the past. But you can choose how to live the time you have left. It's never too late to begin. Zev's gaze softened as he took a deep breath. His anger, his frustration, his pain, they were still there, but they no longer held him captive. He had always thought that time was the enemy. But in that moment, he understood that it was the very thing that had given him everything worth holding on to. The moments, the people, the fleeting beauty of life itself. I understand now, Zev said quietly. I can't change what's been lost. But I can choose how to live from here. The time merchant didn't speak. He didn't need to. His work was done. Zev turned, his heart lighter than it had been in centuries, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he walked away from the booth, not seeking time, but accepting the time he had left. The market was still bustling with life, but Zev no longer felt its weight. He no longer feared what was to come. He simply walked forward, into whatever time remained, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Zev's steps were slow, but each one felt heavier than the last. The market, once alive with noise, now seemed distant to him, as though the world had tilted slightly, casting everything into a new light. He passed by the vendors and their wares, their loud calls barely reaching his ears. The people around him seemed to go on with their lives, oblivious to the epiphany that had just unraveled in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding on, how tightly he had clung to the illusion of control, the idea that if he could just find the right answer, he could make everything right. It was a concept that had consumed him for centuries. But now? Now, it was as if a weight had been lifted, one he hadn't even known was there until it was gone. Zev stopped at the edge of the market, his back to the now distant stall of the time merchant. The crowd behind him was a blur, the sounds of it fading away until all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. The world had slowed, and for the first time in ages, Zev felt the pulse of his own heart. He could feel the beating of it, steady and strong, like the rhythm of life itself. It was nothing special, nothing extraordinary, but it was his. And that was enough. For the first time in centuries, Zev didn't feel the ache of loss, or the sting of regret. He didn't feel as though he were chasing something that would always stay just out of reach. He had spent so long looking for a way to make time stop, to change the past, to escape what was inevitable. But in the quiet of that moment, Zev realized the truth that the time merchant had shown him: there was no escaping time. There was only living within it. His hands trembled as he looked out across the horizon, where the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows over the earth. The evening air was cool, and the breeze rustled through the trees, a simple, soothing sound. He didn't need immortality, didn't need to extend his life any further. He had already lived more than enough for one person, perhaps more than most. But he could still experience what was left. He could still choose to live. The time merchant's words echoed in his mind. Time is not the enemy. It is to be lived. Zev smiled faintly. How strange that it had taken him so long to understand something so simple. He had spent countless years looking for a way to outwit death, trying to stretch time like it was something malleable, something that could be bargained for. But time was not something to be bent. It was something to be honored, even in its fleeting nature. He was interrupted by a familiar voice. So, you're leaving without a goodbye? Zev turned slowly, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the figure standing behind him, the time merchant, his face still hidden under the shadow of his hood, but his presence as clear as ever. The merchant's voice, always calm, always measured, rang in the quiet evening. Zev tilted his head, studying the figure before him. For a moment, he said nothing, simply allowing the silence between them to stretch. Then, he spoke, his voice steady, with a hint of something almost wistful. I've spent too long chasing the wrong things, Zev said. I don't need your elixir. I never did. But thank you, for showing me that. The time merchant's head tilted slightly, a gesture that could have been a smile, but one that Zev could not read. You're welcome, the merchant replied softly, his tone not filled with triumph, but with something else, something almost gentle. I never said the elixir was the answer, Zev. I merely offered what people desired. I showed them their own reflection. But not everyone is ready to see themselves, are they? Zev looked at him, feeling a strange mix of respect and something else, perhaps sympathy. You said I was one of the rare few who understood, Zev said quietly, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. But maybe there's something rarer than understanding. Maybe it's accepting what you can't change. The time merchant said nothing, but the air seemed to grow heavier around them, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, the merchant spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost lost in the evening breeze. You have seen the truth, Zev, he said softly. But not all truths are easy to accept. Not everyone can see what you now see. Zev turned back to face him fully, studying the merchant for a long moment. There was something tragic in the merchant's eyes, something that made Zev pause. He had always seen the time merchant as a shadow, a figure who dealt in illusions. But now, in this quiet moment between them, he saw a deeper truth. You want something, don't you? Zev asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You want people to want the elixir. You want them to believe they can cheat time. But deep down, you know it's a lie. The time merchant didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Zev, his eyes searching, as if weighing the words. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, he replied, I don't want anything, Zev. I am what I am. I reflect the desires of others. But no one ever asked me what I wanted. Perhaps that's the true tragedy of all of this. Zev stood in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in. The time merchant was not the villain he had once believed him to be. He was not some dark force manipulating the world for his own gain. He was simply a reflection of humanity's deepest desire, the desire for more time, for more life. He was the mirror, and they were the ones choosing to look into it, the silence stretched between them, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air like an unspoken understanding. Zev didn't need immortality. He didn't need the elixir. But the time merchant, in his own way, had given him something far more valuable than a promise of endless years. He had shown him the beauty of the moment. The beauty of living with time, not against it. For a long time, Zev didn't say anything. He simply stood there, watching the world unfold before him. The sun was nearly gone now, and the sky had turned a deep shade of purple, streaked with the last traces of daylight. "I won't come back," Zev finally said, his voice clear, but soft. "Not for the elixir. Not for more time. I've had enough." The time merchant nodded, his form blurring slightly as if fading into the horizon, his voice trailing off like a dream. "I know. But remember, Zev, time is not something you can hold on to forever. It is to be lived, as you said. It is the one thing you cannot escape." Zev nodded, his heart calm now, his mind at peace for the first time in centuries. As the time merchant disappeared into the growing darkness, Zev turned his back on the market, on the endless quest for time. He no longer needed it. The world was fading into the night, but Zev walked forward, not afraid, not yearning for more. Just living.